Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said,
"Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things."
He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them,
"If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels."
Let me just ask you a question. Have you ever had that experience where you decided to be a part of something, or to sign up for something, or to get involved in a project, and then at some point in the midst of that project, or that commitment, or that covenant, you reach that level where you say, wait a minute, this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I had in mind when I said yes to whatever. This is not what I expected when I agreed to do this. Is that a common experience?
No.
That is where Peter was in today's reading. Jesus, if you recall, called Peter, and Peter, he was the impetuous one always, but was always excited to just get into it, get busy, and was looking at the whole concept of following the Messiah with grandiose visions of a military conqueror coming in and smiting the Romans and really just resuming the authority of Jewish rule over the land. And in many ways, it was this grand idea that once Jesus came into his own, everything was going to be perfect. Life was going to be restored to beauty and greatness. God would be in charge. There'd be no suffering, no pain, no problems. Everybody's going to love everybody, and the world's going to be a permanently happy place. Or at least, that's what Peter wanted. And accordingly, that is where Peter placed his focus. Peter's whole focus at this point in time was to create for himself and his disciples this utopia of godly control. They would be in charge, sitting at the right hand of Jesus. Everybody would pay homage to them and Jesus. Of course, Jesus would rule. They'd be in charge. Sounds like a pretty good deal, you think? But then Jesus comes around and he starts to change the topic. Jesus says, I'm sorry, Peter, but you have to understand, I'm here because of suffering and rejection and surrender and death. I'm here to do those things that you don't want to do. And Peter's thinking to himself, wait a minute, that can't be, because you're the Messiah, and because I'm following you, I want power and prestige and prominence and dominion. I want to be in charge. I want to control people. I want to rule over people and tell them how to live their lives. That's why I'm following you, Jesus. So whatever you're talking about, suffering and rejection and death and dying, all of that, no. You got it wrong, Jesus. Can you imagine? Just imagine Peter walking over to Jesus and putting his arm around Jesus and saying, hey, Jesus, we got to talk, because you're talking crazy stuff here. Let's get back on track and take over the world.
No.
And Jesus looks at him. Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. Now, we like Jesus, don't we? Now, how many of us would like Jesus to look us in the eye and say, get behind me, Satan? Because you're putting your thoughts on human things, not divine things. Which raises a fundamental question. What exactly is God's realm? God's kingdom? God's dominion? There are a lot of people who interpret God's kingdom as Christians controlling the world. There's a lot of people that say that. There's a lot of people that are convinced that in order to be a good Christian, we have to make everybody else a good Christian according to the tenets of our doctrine. Have you heard that? That's establishing God's kingdom. But that's also where Peter was at. And we have to remember some of the concepts of spiritual blindness that can actually take our thoughts and our minds away from that where we need to be focused. Instead of thinking about divine things, we get fixated on human things. Stuff like prejudice. And I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say, I'm not prejudiced. I love everybody. And I have to think, we're all prejudiced. We are all prejudiced in some way. Perhaps we're prejudiced because of the way somebody has treated us in the past, or the way we have been taught to accept or reject other people. We may be prejudiced because we assume certain things about people, but when we say we're not prejudiced, it's like the Bible says when we say we have no sin, we are liars. We say we have no prejudices, we lie to ourselves, and it's deceitful. We have preferences. I have things that I like. I have things that I don't like. And if you approach me with something I don't like, I'm probably not going to respond the way I would if you approach me with something I like. That's not right or wrong, but that's our humanness, our human beings, our humans' frailties coming through. We have our perceptions. How many of us have completely screwed up a conversation because what you think you heard has nothing to do with what the other person thinks they said? Perceptions. Yeah, exactly. Perceptions. Abraham and Sarah had children at 90 years old, and they thought it was a blessing. I heard Dan say, sounds like a punishment. Perception. You know? Perceptions. And our preconceptions. Those decisions, those assumptions, those biases that we have long before something happens that colors the way that we understand and accept things. There's also our presuppositions, those prejudices, biases that we go for and that we just assume is normal. This is the way people are. Why? Because this is the way I am. So if I'm like that, everybody must be like, have we done that? We also do things for convenience. What works for me. This is the way I like it. So I want to make sure that everything is conveniently put the way I want it. And fear. This is a big one. Truth, you were talking this morning about the chaos at the schools because of something that happened in another community. And people, and I'm sure you've seen this, Truth, and although anybody who's been in the schools has seen this, somebody even breathed the thought of a lockdown at the school, and a whole bunch of panicked parents show up to the school to check their children out because they're afraid. But they don't realize their very presence is actually exacerbating the problem, and they're not going to get their kids out anyway. And then they get mad at law enforcement for telling them no, and the fear just builds and builds. And when you have your focus on the fear, you can't see clear to get done what needs to get done. So often we react out of fear, and one of the biggest things that is destroying our culture today is that our leaders are leading with fear-mongering and threats. And worst case scenarios, if this happens, be afraid. Be very, very afraid. And what fear does is then resorts to anger. Because fear is the seed of anger. And when anger comes out, it's focusing on those human things that destroy us. Now Peter, he was focusing on human things. And in his focus, he decided to rebuke Jesus. He said, "Come on, Jesus, you're crazy talking here. Suffering and death and dying, that's not what we signed up for. Let's get back on agenda here." Now, I can see that probably nobody in this room is going to walk up to Jesus and tell Jesus he's wrong. Are we going to do that?
No.
But we do rebuke Jesus. We rebuke Jesus when we neglect to follow the fullness of Scripture. We rebuke Jesus when we respond to the anger and the hatred and the injustice in our world with indifference. Oh, that's just the way it is. I can't do anything about it. I don't want to get involved. And it becomes an idolatrous focus away from God. We rebuke Jesus when we hear the gospel and then go off and ignore it because it's convenient for us to do what we want. And we certainly don't want to embrace all that suffering stuff that Jesus talks about. And Jesus sits there and says, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan." That great deception. This scripture reminds us that Christian faith, it's not about us. It's not about me. It's not about making First Christian Church the biggest church in Carlsbad. It's not about making everybody think the way we do. It's about taking up the cross and following faithfully. And following faithfully looks like doing justice, working for equality, and insisting on righteousness. So as Christians, it's really vital that we get our story right. Because so often we focus on the wrong story. We focus on the problems and not the solutions. We focus on the media hype and the Facebook story or the fancy meme that seems to solve every problem with just 3 words and a picture, and we don't understand that there is so much more to it. We get caught up in what I call soundbite Christianity. You know what soundbite Christianity is? This is what it looks like. As long as we get our way on abortion, it doesn't matter what else a politician stands for. As long as nobody gets involved in guns and God, that's what matters. As long as your personal salvation and you're right with Jesus and you've said the sinner's prayer, nothing else matters. As long as you're out there advocating for social justice, nothing else matters. As long as your political activism carries your Christian faith, you're all right with Jesus. And they all sound good in their own right, but they miss the bigger point. Because what happens is we get caught up in what I call a narcissistic Christianity, which says, I want to get my needs met. I want to get fed, I want to go to church to feel good, but I certainly don't want this Jesus character talking about death and dying and suffering and rejection. When bad stuff happens in the world, okay, thoughts and prayers, yes, I did my Christian duty. Now I go on and pretend that it doesn't affect me because I don't want it to. It's time we get our story right. Our story is not all about happiness and joy, and the fun things in life. Our story is about a Christ that suffered on the cross. If we don't get our story right, then what we face is the potential of a rebuke from Christ because of our neglect, our indifference, and the idolatrous focus away from God. This morning, I had the privilege of catching a snippet of a sermon that was being preached on the East Coast by a disciples pastor named William Barber. Some of you are familiar with Mr. Barber, Reverend Barber. And he made the point in getting our story right to remember not just the isolated text that we lift up on Sunday morning, but to remember the broad context. Because the story has a beginning, and a middle, and an end. The story has got more to do, on the whole, than anything with Christ's mission for us. And what Reverend Barber pointed out so eloquently this morning was simply this. What was Jesus' first sermon? His first sermon was found in Luke 4, where he says, "The Spirit of God is upon me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, sight to the blind, let the oppressed go free, and proclaim the year of the Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor." That's the first thing that Jesus said. And his last sermon, the last true sermon that he preached, was in Matthew 25, and he said, "Hey, I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was a stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you clothed me. I was sick or in prison, and you visited me." Where in there do you have control? It's about service. And in the middle, between that first sermon where he says, "I am here to bring sight to the blind and release to the captives," and the last sermon where he says, "You did all this to me," in the middle he says things like, "Love one another as I've loved you. Forgive one another. Speak the truth. And take up your cross. Follow me." Take up your cross. So I have to ask, what is our focus? As the first Christian church disciples of Christ in Carlsbad, New Mexico, what is our focus? Is it just to be here in this beautiful building that we now own so that we can affirm and bless one another once a week on Sunday? Or is it to take the ministry of Christ out of this room and be a difference across the street and down the road? Right over here, where the community kitchen serves anywhere from 35 to 75 people on an average lunch. People who otherwise wouldn't have a hot meal. Or just down the street, 2 blocks on Jalapeno, where Carlsbad Transitional Housing has people up every night because they have no home. We live in a world where prejudice and bias still hold people down, where individuals are told they don't deserve God's love because of who they are in love with. We live in a world where still the color of one's skin does make a difference in how someone is treated. And we have got to overcome these problems. We can't do it by dictating, but we can do it by loving. We live in a world where a person's gender still makes a difference in how valued valued that individual is in many professions. This has got to change. We live in a world where it is more expensive to live in poverty than it is to live in wealth. We live in a world where more and more wealth is being pulled away from people and concentrated in a few. This is an injustice. This is a violation of God's will. And we're not going to change it by trying to rule the world. And God never told us to take over the world and run it according to His law. God told us, take up your cross and follow me. For I have been anointed to bring sight to the blind, good news to the poor, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And your call is to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit those who have no hope. To love one another as God has loved us. And through it all know that we are the cross bearers of Jesus Christ. This is our call to become the servants of Christ's